The cold Moscow air in the winter of 1978 wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a metaphor for the state of the Soviet soul, a pervasive, gray chill of stagnation that seeped into the very concrete of the housing blocks and the long, silent queues for basic goods. In this world of drab conformity and whispered desires, the most vibrant economy was the one that operated in the shadows, in the bustling Ryoki markets and the back rooms of cafes. It was here, in this ecosystem of lack and want, that a young man named Sergei Mikhailov, a waiter by trade, began to sketch the blueprint for an empire. His birth on February 7, 1958, was unremarkable, lost in the vast sea of Soviet births. But his mind was a singular anomaly. The restaurant floor was his first boardroom. He mastered the art of anticipation, learning to read the subtle cues of a patron's dissatisfaction or unspoken craving. He understood that service was not about subservience, but about controlling the experience, the flow of goods, and ultimately the satisfaction of a need. This fundamental business principle, learned legally, would become the corrupted cornerstone of his future. The Soviet black market was a chaotic, dangerous place, ruled by brutes and traditional vori v zakone, thieves-in-law, who clung to a rigid, almost medieval code. Mikhailov, who had acquired the innocuous nickname Mikhas, observed this chaos and saw inefficiency. To him, the gangs were poorly managed ventures, leaving profit and opportunity on the table due to a lack of structure and long-term vision. His first forays were exercises in risk assessment and logistics. He didn't start with protection rackets or violent theft. He began with the strategic movement of deficit goods, foreign cigarettes, perfume, vinyl records, and electronics. He built a small, trusted network of couriers and distributors, emphasizing discretion and reliability over bravado. He was a quiet force, a manager in a world of thugs. His early success was not built on fear, but on a reputation for getting things done smoothly. This very success, however, drew the attention of the state's ossified legal system. In 1984, the Soviet machinery, intolerant of any uncontrolled economic activity, caught up with him. He was arrested, tried, and convicted on charges of fraud and theft of socialist property. For many, this conviction would be a career ender, a label that would forever brand them as a common criminal. For Sergei Mikhailov, the prison camp became the crucible that forged the future kingpin. It was within the grim, brutal confines of the Soviet penal system that his theoretical corporation found its founding partners and its core philosophy. He was now surrounded by the nation's most talented outlaws, safecrackers, smugglers, counterfeiters, and enforcers. Here, he didn't just network. He conducted interviews. He sought out men not just with skill, but with patience and the capacity for strategic thought. More importantly, he witnessed firsthand the decaying power of the old Vor code. The romanticized honest thief was often a pauper, constrained by his own rules, while the corrupt prison guards and compliant officials lived well. Mikhailov internalized a critical lesson. True power lay not in defying the system, but in corrupting and integrating with it. He saw the state not as an enemy to be fought, but as a partner to be compromised, a market to be monopolized. His time inside was a masterclass in human leverage, understanding what each man wanted, what he feared, and what price his loyalty would command. He emerged in the late 1980s not as a hardened ex-con, but as a CEO released from an intensive management seminar. He was physically free, but more significantly, his mind was free of the outdated superstitions that governed the old criminal world. He returned to a Moscow that was on the brink of historic convulsion. The pillars of the USSR were cracking, and the air, once thick with fear and ideology, was now electric with a new kind of chaos opportunity. Mikhailov, with his hand-picked team from the camps, was perfectly positioned. He didn't see the collapsing empire as a tragedy. He saw it as a corporate takeover target. The state was about to liquidate its assets, and he intended to be the primary buyer. The old rules were dying. It was time to write new ones. The landscape that greeted Mikhailov upon his release was not merely changing, it was undergoing a violent, seismic deconstruction. The policy of perestroika had unlocked the gates, but it was the rampant Wild West capitalism of the early 1990s that saw those gates torn from their hinges. The Soviet state, once an omnipotent Leviathan, was now a bleeding giant. Its vast economic assets, factories, oil, metals, distribution networks left virtually unguarded. For the common citizen, this was a time of terrifying uncertainty, of evaporated life savings and existential dread. For Sergei Mikhailov and his nascent brotherhood, it was the opening bell of the greatest wealth creation event in criminal history. He did not rush into the fray like a common bandit. Instead, he applied his corporate philosophy with chilling precision. The first order of business was formalizing the partnership. He aligned with two formidable individuals who complemented his own strategic mind. Victor Averin, a shrewd financier with a calm demeanor, and a feared enforcer whose reputation for ruthless efficiency would become legendary. Together, they formed the core of what would be branded by law enforcement as the Solntsevskaya Brotherhood, named after the Solntsevo district of Moscow where they consolidated their power. But this was not a street gang claiming a neighborhood. This was a headquarters establishing a base of operation. Their initial move was to seize control of the district's emerging private businesses, not through simple extortion, but through investment and protection. A shop owner would be approached, not by a thug with a lead pipe, but by a well-dressed man offering a partnership. The terms were simple. The Brotherhood would provide security from other criminal elements and facilitate supply through their growing networks. In return, they would take a significant, often controlling stake in the profits. Refusal was not presented as an option, but the offer was cloaked in the language of business, making resistance seem not just dangerous, but irrational. Why choose chaos when you could choose the stability and growth offered by this new consortium? This model of forced partnership was replicated across dozens of enterprises, from auto repair shops and casinos to the first fledgling banks. Simultaneously, Mikhailov was executing a masterstroke on a macro level as the Soviet government began the calamitous process of privatizing state-owned assets through voucher schemes. His organization mobilized, using front companies, shell corporations, and a small army of compliant shareholders, often citizens coerced or paid to sign over their vouchers. The Brotherhood began a silent, systematic acquisition of stakes in lucrative sectors, metallurgy, transportation, and most critically, the export of natural resources. They didn't just want street cash. They wanted the very machinery of the nation's wealth. To protect this rapidly expanding portfolio, Mikhailov oversaw the creation of a private security apparatus that dwarfed many state forces. Recruits came from the ranks of former Spetsnaz, Special Forces, Olympic athletes, and the most disciplined veterans of the Afghan War. They were not mere muscle. They were a privatized military trained, organized, and equipped with superior weaponry and communications technology than the underfunded police. This security wing served multiple functions. It enforced the Brotherhood's will, it protected its asset, and acted as an intelligence agency, identifying rivals, weak officials, and new opportunities. Mikhailov himself operated from a remove, always the executive. He was known for his calm, almost monastic demeanor, his preference for strategic discussions over rowdy celebration. He built a public facade of respectability, investing in legitimate charities in Solntsevo and cultivating an image as a benefactor, a necessary evil in a time of state collapse. But beneath this veneer, the empire was consolidating through calculated violence. Rival gangs that attempted to muscle in on Solntsevskaya territories were not just fought, they were analyzed, their leadership structures targeted for decapitation, and their operations either absorbed or obliterated in stunning, clinical strikes that served as object lessons for the entire Moscow underworld. The message was clear. This was not a turf war, it was a merger. And Solntsevskaya was the acquiring company. By the mid-1990s, the transformation was complete. Sergei Mikhailov was no longer a former waiter or an ex-con. He was the chairman of a diversified conglomerate with interests spanning continents, whose board meeting determined prices on black markets, and whose human resources department could authorize a death sentence. The Soviet Union was gone. In its place, in the gleaming, chaotic new Moscow, a new power had risen, one that was more organized, more wealthy, and in many ways more stable than the crumbling government it shadowed. The corporation was now fully operational, and its IPO was paid for in blood and ambition. That domestic conquest of Moscow was merely the proving ground, the successful corporate merger that provided the capital and confidence for an ambitious initial public offering on the global market. Sergei Mikhailov's vision was never confined by borders. His model was inherently expansionist, a franchise system for crime. The collapse of the Iron Curtain had not only opened Russia's vaults to plunder but had also created a spiderweb of vulnerable transit routes and nascent, regulation-starved economies across Eastern Europe and beyond. The Solntsevskaya Brotherhood, now flush with capital and boasting a paramilitary wing of unprecedented sophistication, looked westward. Their first major international venture was a natural extension of their core competency, the commodification of desire and the exploitation of systemic weakness. The vehicle for this global expansion was a trio of interlinked trades that would define the post-Soviet criminal landscape: weapons, drugs, and human beings. The chaotic aftermath of the Soviet military's disintegration presented an opportunity of staggering scale. Vast arsenals, from Makarov pistols to tank battalions worth of heavy weaponry, sat in poorly guarded depots across the former republics. Mikhailov's organization, with its networks of corrupt officers and logistical genius, became the premier wholesale exporter of this deadly surplus. Cargo planes and freight trains, ostensibly carrying legitimate goods, began moving east to west, feeding conflicts in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and eventually into the hands of insurgent groups and other criminal syndicates across the globe. This was not opportunistic gun running. It was a structured, high-volume arms dealership operating with corporate efficiency, complete with procurement officers, shipping managers, and regional sales directors. Parallel to this river of steel flowed an even more lucrative pipeline: narcotics. Seeing the booming demand in Europe, the Brotherhood moved to control the supply chain from source to street. They forged strategic alliances with existing cartels and producers in Afghanistan and Colombia, not as subordinate partners but as equal stakeholders, providing the unrivaled logistics, security, and European distribution networks that the producers lacked. They established processing labs in the forests of Eastern Europe and used their control over ports and transportation hubs to move heroin and cocaine with a reliability that embarrassed legitimate courier services. The third pillar, and perhaps the most chilling in its human cost, was trafficking in people. The economic despair of the former Soviet bloc created a surplus of vulnerable humanity, desperate men, women, and children seeking a better life in the West. The Brotherhood commodified this despair. They built elaborate networks of recruiters, safe houses, corrupt officials, and transportation, offering false promises of jobs and safety that led instead to a life of forced labor, debt bondage, or sexual exploitation across the brothels of Europe and the Middle East. This trifecta of illicit trades, weapons, drugs, and humans was managed not as separate fiefdoms but as synergistic divisions of one holding company. A shipment of weapons to a conflict zone could be paid for with heroin. A corridor established for moving drugs could be used to traffic individuals. The profits from one venture funded the expansion of another. To manage this sprawling, multinational enterprise, Mikhailov pioneered financial infrastructure that was years ahead of its time. He employed mathematicians and former KGB economists to create a labyrinthine system of shell companies, offshore banks, and complex trade-based money laundering schemes. They would use falsified invoices for seemingly legitimate goods like timber, fertilizer, or steel to move hundreds of millions of dollars across borders, layering transaction upon transaction until the criminal origin of the funds was lost in a digital fog. This financial wizardry allowed them to reinvest their profits into further legitimate and illegitimate ventures worldwide, from real estate in Spain and luxury hotels in Turkey to banks in Cyprus and investment funds in the Caribbean. Mikhailov himself became a ghost in this machine, a name on doctor passports and corporate registries. Always moving, always insulated, he cultivated relationships with compromised politicians and intelligence officers, not just in Russia, but in dozens of countries, building a protective shield of compromat and patronage. The Solntsevskaya Brotherhood was no longer a Russian mafia group. It had evolved into a transnational criminal corporation, a dark mirror of the legitimate globalized economy it parasitically fed upon. Its boardroom was wherever Mikhailov sat. Its headquarters were in the cloud of encrypted communication. Its bottom line was measured in currency, power, and an ever-growing inventory of human misery. The local boss from Solntsevo had successfully executed a hostile takeover of segments of the global black market, and the world was only beginning to understand the scale, sophistication of the new competitor in its midst. This era of unchallenged expansion and audacious globalization, however, sowed the very seeds of its own confrontation as the Solntsevskaya Corporation's shadow grew longer, stretching across time zones and impregnating the financial systems of the democratic world. It finally crossed a threshold of visibility that demanded a response. The catalyst was not a single dramatic crime, but the sheer, undeniable weight of their economic footprint. Law enforcement agencies from Washington, D.C. to Bern, who had traditionally viewed organized crime as a local nuisance, began to connect the dots. A massive heroin seizure in a Rotterdam port, traced through a web of front companies, led to a money laundering operation in New York. An investigation into a prostitution ring in Tel Aviv revealed financial links to a Cypriot bank owned by shadowy Russian interests. The pattern that emerged was not of disparate criminal acts, but of a single, chillingly coherent operational pattern. The name Mikhailov began to appear with alarming frequency in classified intelligence briefing, no longer as a rumor from Moscow's underworld, but as a designated priority target. The response was the birth of a new kind of policing, the multi-jurisdictional task force. Agencies that had historically been territorial and suspicious of one another, the FBI, the DEA, Interpol, MI6, the French DST, and Germany's BKA were forced into an uneasy alliance. They pooled intelligence, resources, and legal authority, creating a fragmented but determined mirror image of the criminal network they sought to dismantle. Their strategy shifted from arresting street-level operatives to following the money, the one trail the Brotherhood could not fully erase. This international gaze focused a harsh light on Mikhailov's carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. His movements, once discreet, were now tracked. His associates were identified, photographed, and their communications monitored. The pressure manifested first not in a courtroom, but in the realm of reputation and personal security. In 1993, an event occurred that would become a dark legend and a turning point: the assassination of Vladislav Bobon-Listyev, a beloved Russian television journalist, and the newly appointed head of the country's first independent TV channel, who had vowed to clean up corrupt advertising practices. While no direct evidence ever linked Mikhailov to the killing, the murder sent seismic shock waves through Russian society and the underworld. It was a brazen attack on a public figure in the heart of Moscow, a signal that the new criminal corporations believed themselves above all law. even the unwritten ones of public decency. The outcry was immediate and intense, forcing even a weakened Russian state to be seen taking action. More critically, it painted a target on the backs of those perceived as the untouchable oligarchs of crime. For Mikhailov, the world was suddenly contracting. Safe havens grew fewer. Old allies, feeling the heat, became potential liability. The corporate model now faced its greatest stress test. Could it withstand the focused attention of the combined Western world? The answer began to unfold in Switzerland, a nation synonymous with discreet banking. In 1995, Swiss authorities, acting on a tip from their foreign counterparts, raided a luxury chalet in the alpine resort of Chateau d'Aux. Inside, they did not find Sergei Mikhailov, but they found something equally valuable, a trove of financial records, and, most damningly, a legitimate Costa Rican diplomatic passport issued in Mikhailov's name. The possession of this document, suggesting a level of corruption that reached into foreign government, was a propaganda coup for law enforcement and a scandal of international proportion. It proved that Mikhailov was not just a gangster hiding in shells, he was a global actor, manipulating the instruments of state sovereignty for his protection. The Swiss, fiercely protective of their reputation, moved with uncharacteristic speed. They issued an international arrest warrant. For the first time, Sergei Mikhailov, the ghostly chairman of the board, had a formal public label from the legitimate world, international fugitive. The Interpol red notice was not merely a piece of paper. It was a spell that broke his cloak of invisibility. He could no longer travel freely to oversee his empire's divisions. Every border crossing, every airport lounge became a potential trap. The corporation's CEO was now grounded, his strategic mobility, a key asset, severely compromised. The chill of the Moscow winter he had known as a young man was now replaced by the cold, institutional gaze of global justice, and it was following him home. That Swiss warrant and the ensuing Interpol red notice did not, as some in law enforcement might have hoped, trigger a panicked collapse of the Solntsevskaya Empire. Instead, it initiated a sophisticated corporate crisis management protocol. Sergei Mikhailov, the master strategist, understood that his personal liberty was now a critical business risk that needed to be mitigated. Retreating to the heart of his power base in Moscow, he did not go to ground in fear. He fortified his position. Russia in the mid-1990s was a uniquely protective ecosystem for a man like him. The state was weak, its legal system malleable, and the lines between political power, business, and organized crime were not so much blurred as completely erased. Mikhailov leveraged his immense wealth and network of Krisha, literally roof or protection within the government and security services, to create an impregnable legal and physical fortress around himself. He became a ghost in plain sight, living a life of curated public appearances and entrenched private security, all while his lawyers worked tirelessly to dismantle the international case against him. His defense was a masterclass in leveraging the chaos of the transition era. He and his spokespeople crafted a compelling, alternative narrative for public consumption. Sergei Mikhailov was not a mafia boss, but a successful, pioneering Russian businessman, a victim of Western persecution and jealousy. He was framed, they claimed, because he had the vision to succeed where the West wanted Russian entrepreneurs to fail. This narrative found fertile ground in a national psyche steeped in resentment and conspiracy theories. He invested even more heavily in his image as a philanthropist, funding local schools, sports clubs, and community centers in Solntsevo, ensuring his base of popular support remained loyal. Meanwhile, the operational command of the global empire was further decentralized. Trusted lieutenants, like Viktor Averin, assumed greater autonomy over international divisions, communicating through ever more complex encryption and cutouts. The business adapted, becoming even more virtual and resilient. Yet, the pressure from abroad was unrelenting. In 1996, It materialized in a form that could not be ignored by the Russian state itself. Under immense diplomatic pressure, Russian authorities were compelled to act. Mikhailov was arrested in Moscow. The news sent shockwaves around the world. Had the fortress been breached? The trial of Sergei Mikhailov that followed was less a legal proceeding and more a theatrical performance. A high-stakes duel between the tenacious, evidence-driven world of international law enforcement and the murky, influence-saturated reality of post-Soviet Russia. The prosecution, armed with volumes of translated foreign evidence, painted a picture of a criminal kingpin. They presented financial records, intercepted communications analyses, and testimony from international investigators detailing the Brotherhood's structure and operation. The evidence was circumstantial. In the classic sense, it depicted the scale and reach of the organization, but directly tying Mikhailov to specific violent acts was a challenge his defense exploited mercilessly. Mikhailov's legal team, likely the most expensive and well-connected ever, assembled for a Russian criminal trial, attacked on multiple fronts. They challenged the admissibility of foreign evidence, citing procedural irregularities and alleged biases. They presented Mikhailov as a dignified, wronged businessman, a family man who had made his fortune in the chaotic but legitimate privatizations of the early 1990s. They argued that the Swiss case was a misunderstanding stemming from a legitimate business relationship gone sour, and the diplomatic passport was merely a tool for a man who traveled frequently for trade. Most effectively, they tapped into a powerful undercurrent of Russian nationalism. The trial was framed in the media. They influenced as a show trial orchestrated by the West, an attempt to humiliate Russia by imprisoning one of its most successful new sons. Key witnesses suffered from sudden, crippling memory loss. Documents went missing. The sheer complexity and global scale of the prosecution's case, its greatest strength, also became a weakness in the context of a Moscow courtroom where judges were unfamiliar with international financial tracing and susceptible to political and other influences. The climax of the trial was a moment of pure, surreal tension. After months of proceedings, the judge delivered a verdict that echoed around the globe: not guilty. Sergei Mikhailov was free to walk out of the courtroom for the international task forces. It was a devastating defeat, a demonstration of the impunity that vast wealth and political connections could buy in the new Russia. For Mikhailov and his organization, it was the ultimate validation of their strategy. It was more than an acquittal. It was a coronation. He had faced down the combined legal might of the West and the Russian state itself and emerged victorious. The message was unequivocal. He was untouchable. The Solntsevskaya Brotherhood was not just a criminal enterprise. It was a sovereign power. In the aftermath, Mikhailov did not disappear. He became more brazen, a celebrity don. He gave interviews to select journalists, always maintaining his innocent businessman persona. He expanded his legitimate holdings, buying into energy, media, and construction. The empire, stress-tested by the trial, seemed stronger than ever. The victory, however, was Pyrrhic. It had required the full expenditure of his political capital and exposed the limits of his influence within a Russia that was slowly, fitfully beginning to change under a new, more centralized and intolerant leadership. He had won the battle, but the war for his legacy was just entering a new, more dangerous phase. The acquittal was not an endpoint, but a precarious summit from its height. Sergei Mikhailov could survey an empire that spanned continents, its revenues flowing in from drug routes, energy scams, and protection rackets with the relentless rhythm of a Fortune 500 company. Yet, the very altitude brought new and dangerous weather. The triumphant return to his Solntsevo stronghold was met with a shifting political landscape in Russia that would prove far more challenging than any foreign court. The rise of Vladimir Putin to the presidency at the turn of the millennium heralded a new era defined by the re-centralization of state power, the reining in of the oligarchs, both legitimate and illegitimate, and the unambiguous message that there could be only one real authority in Russia, the Kremlin. For the first time since the chaotic 1990s, Mikhailov faced a domestic power that was not weak, corruptible, and fragmented, but increasingly strong, nationalist, and demanding of loyalty on its own terms. The unwritten social contract of the Yeltsin years, where the state turned a blind eye to criminal accumulation in exchange for stability and political support, was being rewritten. The new contract was simple. You could keep your wealth, but you would cease to exist as an independent political or criminal power. Your infrastructure, your armed enforcers, your international networks would now be considered assets of the state, to be co-opted or dismantled as the Kremlin saw fit. This presented Mikhailov with an existential dilemma. His entire life's work was built on the principle of sovereign corporate independence, of being a power parallel to, and often stronger than, the state. To submit was to dismantle his own creation. To resist was to declare war on a state that had just demonstrated in its brutal campaign in Chechnya a willingness and capacity for overwhelming violence. The initial skirmishes in this Cold War were subtle. Former allies and subordinates within his organization began to receive offers from state security organs, the FSB and the GRU, that were impossible to refuse. These offers were not for arrest, but for partnership. The state sought to harness the Brotherhood's logistical genius, its international corridors, and its intelligence-gathering capabilities for its own purposes, smuggling sanctioned goods, conducting deniable operations abroad, or consolidating control over strategic economic sectors. Some of Mikhailov's lieutenants, seeing the direction of the wind, chose the certainty of state patronage over the waning autonomy of the Brotherhood. This gradual co-option was a silent, bureaucratic siege more threatening than any police raid. Simultaneously, the international news, though loosened by the Moscow acquittal, continued to tighten with a patient, grinding persistence. The events of September 11, 2001 transformed global security priorities, placing terrorist financing and transnational criminal networks at the very top of the agenda. The Solntsevskaya Brotherhood, with its arms trafficking, money laundering, and global reach, was now squarely in the crosshairs of a newly empowered and fiercely motivated U.S. Department of Justice and Treasury. Financial warfare became the primary weapon. In 2003, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control designated several individuals and entities linked to the Brotherhood under the Kingpin Act and other executive orders, freezing their U.S. assets and prohibiting any American citizen or company from doing business with them. This was a death sentence in the global financial system. Banks around the world, terrified of losing their access to the critical U.S. market, began de-risking, closing accounts, and severed ties not just with the named individuals, but with any Russian business or figure that carried even a whiff of association. Mikhailov's carefully constructed lattice of offshore accounts, front companies began to crumble under this compliance avalanche. Moving money, the lifeblood of his empire, became exponentially harder, costlier, and riskier. The corporate model was built on fluid capital. Now the pipes were clogging with the cement of international sanction. The pressure was now bifocal, from a resurgent Russian state demanding fealty and assimilation from within, and from a relentless international financial system pushing him towards pariah status from without. Mikhailov, the master adapter, was forced into a defensive crouch. He began a strategic retreat from the flashy, public role of the untouchable boss. He divested from some of his more visible legitimate holdings in Russia and abroad, selling assets to opaque intermediaries who were likely fronts for state-connected entities. He reportedly funneled vast sums into less traceable stores of value, luxury real estate in Dubai, art, gold, and cryptocurrency in its earliest, most unregulated forms. The goal was no longer expansion, but preservation and obfuscation. The once brazen CEO was becoming a silent partner, a name whispered in back channels rather than proclaimed in boardrooms. The empire was not dissolving, but it was metamorphosing, its shape becoming harder to define, its leader becoming a legend rather than an active daily manager. This period marked the beginning of his true downfall, not a dramatic arrest or a violent death, but a gradual, forced transition from a sovereign power to a managed asset, a ghost in the machine he once commanded. The sun of the Solntsevskaya Brotherhood's midday brilliance was beginning its slow, inexorable descent. The long, slow squeeze from both east and west forced a fundamental reinvention, a corporate restructuring dictated not by market opportunity but by existential threat. Sergei Mikhailov's genius had always been his anticipatory instincts, and he now sensed that the era of the independent criminal conglomerate, flaunting its power and challenging state primacy, was drawing to a definitive close. The path forward was one of strategic diminishment and deep camouflage. The first and most critical step was a voluntary demobilization of the Brotherhood's most visible instrument of power, its private army. The battalions of expats and athletes, once the envy of rival gangs and the terror of entrepreneurs, were gradually disbanded or, more accurately, absorbed. Many of these highly trained personnel, along with their commanders, were seamlessly integrated into state-sanctioned private military companies, PMCs, or the security apparatuses of loyal oligarchs. This was not a defeat, but a calculated asset transfer. It removed a glaring provocation from the eyes of the Kremlin, while ensuring the skill and loyalty of his enforcers remained within the broader ecosystem he still influenced. Next came the systematic sanitization of his public profile. The philanthropic lord of Solntsevo persona was dialed down. Interviews ceased. Public appearances became rarer than ever, limited to heavily secured private events. He cultivated the image of a retired businessman, a man who had made his fortune in the turbulent 90s and was now enjoying the fruits of his labor in quiet luxury. This was a conscious effort to recede from the narrative, to make the world forget the name Mikhas as an active threat. Beneath this placid surface, however, the commercial engine of the empire continued to hum, but its operations underwent a radical simplification and risk mitigation. The high-volume, high-risk international trafficking of weapons and bulk narcotics was deliberately scaled back. These sectors had become too hot, too heavily monitored by global intelligence agencies post 9/11. Instead, the focus shifted to less conspicuous, higher margin, and digitally facilitated crimes. Cybercrime became a new and lucrative division. The Brotherhood began to recruit and protect talented hackers, funding schemes ranging from large-scale credit card fraud and ransomware attacks on Western corporations to sophisticated phishing operations that targeted the very financial institutions, now blacklisting them. This was a perfect evolution. It was borderless, required minimal physical infrastructure, and generate profits in cryptocurrency, which offered a new, albeit volatile, haven for wealth storage. Similarly, their focus in the drug trade pivoted from being transcontinental wholesalers to controlling the refined retail end within Russia and its immediate sphere of influence, particularly synthetic drugs and the precursors for their manufacture. A market less dependent on vulnerable long-distance supply chains from South America or Asia. Financial operations became hyper-focused on exploiting the remaining weaknesses in the form Soviet republics using Moldovan, Latvian, or Armenian banks as laundromats before the money was moved into complex European real estate investments, or used to buy stable, portable assets like high-end Swiss watches, diamonds, or vintage cars that could be easily sold globally. This restructuring was Mikhailov's most profound masterstroke as a manager. He was downsizing and outsourcing the risky, physical elements of his business while investing in the future of illicit finance and cyber-enabled crime. He transformed his organization from a sprawling, targetable industrial giant into a lean, agile, and decentralized venture capital firm for criminal innovation. His role evolved from CEO to a kind of shadowy angel investor and consultant, providing capital, connections, and crucia to a new generation of criminal entrepreneurs, taking a significant cut of their profits in return for protection and wisdom. This model made him even harder to prosecute. He was no longer giving direct orders for a shipment of heroin. He was providing seed funding for a hacker collective in Romania. The paper trail, tenuous before, now dissolved into the fog of the dark web and encrypted messaging apps. The man who had once been arrested with a fraudulent diplomatic passport was now a spectral figure whose influence was everywhere and nowhere, a name invoked with reverence in certain circles but absent from any actionable ledger. This was not the downfall of a king, but his transformation into a myth. The empire had not fallen. It had gone underground, digitized, and dispersed, its beating heart now a silent, encrypted server in a data haven, its currency lines of code, and its capo de capi a ghost in the machine, waiting, and collecting his dividends from the shadows of a world he helped create but could no longer openly rule. This strategic retreat into the digital shadows and the veneer of retirement, however, could not entirely erase the past or shield Mikhailov from the long, unforgiving arm of international justice. Wit operates on a timescale far removed from the hectic pace of criminal enterprise. While he meticulously curated his low-profile present, prosecutors across multiple jurisdictions were engaged in the painstaking, years-long work of building airtight cases, stitching together decades-old evidence with new financial forensic techniques. The calm he projected was an illusion, shattered in the late 2000s, early 2010s by a series of legal earthquakes emanating from Europe. The first major tremor came from Spain, a country that had long been a favored haven for Russian illicit capital invested in Costa del Sol marinas and luxury villas. In a massive operation codenamed Operation Troika, Spanish authorities, in collaboration with the FBI and Europol, targeted a vast money laundering network that served as a financial hub for the Solntsevskaya Brotherhood and other post-Soviet groups. The investigation, spanning years, uncovered a complex web of front companies, real estate purchases, and bank transfers that directly linked back to Mikhailov's inner circle. While he was not in the dock personally, the operation resulted in the arrest of several key financial facilitators and the seizure of tens of millions of euros in assets. It was a devastating blow to his financial infrastructure, proving that the sanitized money trails of the 1990s could be retroactively decoded with modern technology and cross-border cooperation. Then came the case that would strike closest to the man himself. In 2010, a Swiss court, revisiting the old demons of the 1990s, tried Mikhailov in absentia on charge related to money laundering and criminal association stemming from the original 1995 investigation. This time, the evidence was more robust, the political will stronger. He was convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. While extradition from Russia was a political impossibility, the conviction had profound symbolic and practical consequences. It formally branded him a convicted felon in the heart of Europe, permanently closing off any legitimate travel or business avenues there and further poisoning his name in the global financial system. But the most significant, and perhaps most humbling, legal assault was yet to come. It arrived not from the west, but from unexpected eastern flank, Thailand. For years, Mikhailov and his associates had used Thailand as a leisure and business hub, enjoying its tropical climate and relatively lax oversight. In August 2017, Thai immigration police, acting on a tip believed to be orchestrated by a Western agency, detained Mikhailov upon his arrival at a Bangkok airport. The grounds were startling. He was accused of being the leader of an international criminal syndicate and of violating Thai immigration law by failing to declare a criminal record. For several tense days, he was held in detention, the world watching as news agencies broadcast the image of the once untouchable Mikhas looking weary and strained behind the bars of a Thai immigration cell. This was a moment of supreme vulnerability, a stark, undignified fall from the gilded cages of Moscow mansions and Swiss chalets. The arrest demonstrated a terrifying new reality. No country was truly safe anymore. Global information sharing had reached a point where even a vacation could become a trap. The Thai episode, while it did not result in extradition, Russian diplomat swiftly intervened, likely applying immense pressure and striking behind-the-scenes deals to secure his release and deportation back to Moscow was a psychological and reputational watershed. It proved that his ghost strategy had limits. He could be touched, he could be humiliated, he could be made to stand in a holding cell like a common tourist who overstayed a visa. The image of the corporate titan was replaced, for a brief global news cycle, with that of a detained suspect. This sequence of legal events, the Spanish dismantling of his financial network, the Swiss conviction, and the Thai humiliation collectively marked the true operational downfall of Sergei Mikhailov as a global actor. It did not put him in a foreign prison, but it accomplished something perhaps more effective. It territorially shrank his world. Europe was now a juridical no-go zone. Traditional safe havens in Asia were compromised. His movement was effectively restricted to Russia and a handful of fiercely loyal or utterly lawless client states. The empire's global reach was forced to contract managed remotely through intermediaries who themselves were now under heightened scrutiny. The CEO was under a form of house arrest, confined to the nation that was both his protector and his prison. The long arc of international justice, though it failed to incarcerate him, had succeeded in caging his influence, proving that while he could win battles in Moscow courtrooms, he could not ultimately win the war against the patient, cumulative pressure of a united global front. The legend of Mikhas endured, but his passport told the story of a man whose world had grown very, very small. The Thai detention was more than an incident. It was a piercing flare that illuminated the precarious reality behind the myth. Forced back to Moscow, Sergei Mikhailov entered the final, most complex phase of his existence, the transition from active godfather to institutionalized legend. His world now existed almost entirely within the borders of the Russian Federation, a nation that had itself transformed into a firm state under Vladimir Putin, where all power, including criminal power, was expected to be subordinate to and aligned with the interests of the Kremlin. This was the ultimate corporate takeover, and Mikhailov had little choice but to become a preferred, if closely watched, subsidiary. His survival and the preservation of his remaining fortune depended on a delicate, unspoken bargain. He would renounce any pretension to independent political or criminal authority. His remaining networks would be available for state use when called upon, and in return, he would be allowed to live in peace and enjoy his wealth, serving as a living testament to the state's ultimate control. This phase required a different kind of cunning, not the bold strategy of empire building, but the subtle, patient art of appearing harmless while maintaining a shred of dignity and influence. His public life narrowed to a pinpoint. He was occasionally spotted at exclusive Moscow restaurants or high society events, always surrounded by a discreet but formidable security detail. But he never spoke to the press. He became a spectral patron of the arts, anonymously donating to certain theaters or film projects, a practice that allowed him to maintain ties to a cultural elite without drawing the political spotlight. His primary residence, a fortified estate outside Moscow, became his sanctuary and his gilded cage. Here, he reportedly immersed himself in the minutiae of managing his sanitized investments, legitimate holdings in logistics, construction, and perhaps even tech startups, all carefully vetted to avoid any direct conflict with state-sanctioned monopolies or the interests of Kremlin-connected oligarchs. The violent, street-level operations of the old Solntsevskaya were a distant memory, either disbanded or fully absorbed into the state's own apparatus. The Brotherhood as a monolithic entity was largely a relic. Its legacy lived on in the thousands of individuals it had spawned, businessmen, officials, and security chiefs, who now occupied positions across Russian society, a diaspora of influence rather than a commanded army. Mikhailov's power became derivative, based on respect, history, and the latent fear of what he still might know. Rather than on any active command structure, he was the emeritus chairman, consulted on occasion for his deep institutional memory of the wild 90s and his understanding of the international underworld, but no longer setting the agenda. This role as a grey cardinal suited the state perfectly. He was a living archive of post-Soviet crime, a symbol of an era that had been tamed and brought to heel. His continued freedom demonstrated the state's magnanimity and its absolute power. It could have crushed him at any time, but it chose to let him exist as a trophy. For Mikhailov, this was a bittersweet twilight. He had achieved the impossible survival, evading the violent end that met so many of his contemporaries, shot in their cars, poisoned in London, or blown up in their apartment blocks. He had wealth beyond measure and a form of security. Yet, the autonomy, the thrill of global enterprise, the power to shape events across continents was gone. He was a museum piece of his own creation, forced to watch as a new generation of criminals, often with direct state patronage, operate with an impunity he could only have dreamed of at his peak, but with none of the entrepreneurial independence he had championed. These new actors were not corporate builders. They were state contractors, executing political and economic hit jobs under the cover of patriotism. His story, from ambitious waiter to global don to retired relic, became a cautionary tale etched into the history of Russian crime. It illustrated the trajectory of power in modern Russia. All roads, even those paved with illicit billion and hardened by blood, ultimately lead back to, and must bow before, the singular authority of the state. Sergei Mikhailov, alive and free, was perhaps the ultimate proof that in the end, the state had won. His downfall was not in poverty or prison, but in irrelevance, a negotiated surrender that allowed him to keep the treasures of his past, but cost him the sovereignty that had been his life's defining pursuit. He became a ghost in his own country, a whisper from a bygone era, his greatest legacy being the blueprint he created for a criminal corporation, a blueprint that was now state property. The story of Sergei Mikhailov, however, cannot be confined to the biography of a single man, no matter how formidable. His true legacy, the indelible mark he left upon the world, is the institutional and operational DNA he implanted into global organized crime, a blueprint that outlived his own operational decline and continues to shape illicit enterprises to this day. Mikhailov was the archetypal architect of the modern transnational criminal corporation. Before him, the Italian Mafia, the Japanese Yakuza, and even the traditional Vori Vizakoni were deeply cultural, insular organizations, bound by rituals, ethnic ties, and codes that limited their scalability. Mikhailov, the pragmatist from the Soviet service industry, stripped crime of its romance and rebranded it as a sector-agnostic management challenge. His model was ruthlessly exportable and endlessly adaptable. It proved that with sufficient capital, corruption, and cold intelligence, any illicit market could be vertically integrated, and any state weakness could be leveraged into a profit center. This philosophy spawned imitators and successors across the post-Soviet space and beyond. The entire landscape of Russian-speaking organized crime, from the Tambov gang in St. Petersburg to brutal syndicate in Odessa and Kyrgyzstan, either adopted his corporate structure or were forced to evolve in response to it. More significantly, his pioneering work in merging financial infrastructure with illicit logistics provided a masterclass for criminal groups worldwide. Mexican cartels, witnessing the Solntsevskaya's success in moving money through trade-based laundering in offshore havens, sophisticated their own financial operation. Nigerian cybercrime networks adopted his decentralized, franchise-like model. Even terrorist organizations studied his methods for moving funds and weapons across borders with a corporate sheen. The very term brotherhood belied its true nature. It was never a fraternity, but a holding company with a human resources department that happened to specialize in violence. This corporatization had a paradoxical effect on global law enforcement. It forced police and intelligence agencies to abandon their narrow, jurisdictional views of crime and develop the very multi-agency, international task forces that eventually hounded Mikhailov. In a real sense, he was the godfather of modern financial intelligence. Units and entities like Europol's European Cybercrime Center. He made the world realize that crime had gone multinational, and the response had to follow. Yet, perhaps his most profound and unsettling legacy lies in his demonstration of the porous membrane between the criminal and the legitimate in a globalized economy. At his peak, Mikhailov didn't just bribe officials, he partnered with them. He didn't just hide money. He invested it in pillars of the legitimate world banks, real estate, energy projects. He illustrated with terrifying clarity how illicit capital, in sufficient volume, could distort markets, corrupt political systems, and become a silent, powerful stakeholder in the very foundations of democratic societies. The luxury apartments in London and Miami, the yachts in Monaco, the football clubs across Europe, purchased with questionable wealth, all bear the imprint of the pathway he helped pioneer. He proved that in the late 20th and early 21st century, the most successful criminal was not the one who could wield the most violence, but the one who could most convincingly mimic and then infiltrate the rituals and institutions of legitimate power. His life stands as a dark benchmark for criminal success, measured not in years served in prison, but in the scale of wealth accumulated and the breadth of influence wielded before a forced, but non-lethal, retirement. For aspiring kingpins, he became both an inspiration and a warning, an inspiration to think bigger, to act globally, to embrace technology and finance, and a warning of the inevitable collision with state power, which tolerates parallel authority only until it decides not to. In the end, Mikhailov's story is the story of our interconnected worlds, dark twin narrative of globalization, innovation, and ruthless ambition, mirroring the rise of Silicon Valley titans and oil magnates, but conducted in the shadows with a different, more brutal set of commodities. His downfall was not a failure of his model, but a testament to its success. He grew so powerful that he attracted the concerted opposition of the entire civilized world and the jealous absorption of his own homeland's resurgent state. The corporation he built may have been dismantled, repurposed, or driven underground, but its prospectus remains a foundational text in the annals of illicit enterprise, studied by criminals and cops alike, a chilling reminder of what is possible when a brilliant, immoral mind applies the principles of business to the oldest trade in the world. To truly grasp the scale of Sergei Mikhailov, enterprise, and the nature of his downfall, one must venture beyond the man and into the machinery, the cold, intricate systems that powered his empire and which ultimately became the focal point for its unraveling. The most critical of these systems was not his enforcers or his drug routes, but his financial architecture, a creation of such sophistication that it rivaled the treasury operations of small nations. At its heart was a principle Mikhailov understood instinctively: liquidity is life, and obscurity is armor. To achieve both, he and his financial strategists, many of whom were former Soviet central bank economists, construct a multi-layered laundering apparatus that functioned like a global circulatory system for dirty money. The first layer was the placement stage, executed within Russia and the former Soviet republics through a network of obshaks, communal criminal funds, and shell companies that generated false paperwork for fictitious imports and exports. A company in Moscow would pay a company in Latvia for a massive shipment of timber that never existed, or for consulting services that were never rendered. The dirty cash would thus be transformed into a legitimate-looking intercompany debt. The second layer, layering, involved dizzying international movement. The funds would be wired through a daisy chain of banks in Cyprus, Switzerland, the British Virgin Islands, and Hong Kong. Each transaction would be split, merged, and redirected, often using Havala-style informal value transfer systems to break the electronic trail. The third and final stage, integration, saw the cleansed money re-enter the legitimate economy as pristine investment capital. It would be used to purchase luxury real estate in London's Belgravia or Manhattan's Fifth Avenue, acquire stakes in European football club, fund Hollywood film productions, or buy substantial shares in publicly traded companies on stock exchanges from Frankfurt to Toronto. This system was not static. It evolved with regulation. When Western governments began scrutinizing shell companies, his network pivoted to using complex trust structures and nominee directors. When real estate markets tightened checks, they moved to investing in high-value art, vintage cars, and precious gems, assets that are portable, notoriously difficult to value, and traded in a secretive global market. This financial genius was the bedrock of his power, allowing him to pay armies, bribe officials on an industrial scale, and project an image of invincible, legitimate wealth. However, this very system contained the seeds of his vulnerability. The complexity required a vast human network: bankers, lawyers, accountants, and notaries. Each was a potential point of failure. The international crackdown post 9/11, with its focus on terrorist financing, brought unprecedented scrutiny to the very financial corridors Mikhailov relied upon. Agencies like the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crime Enforcement Network, FinCEN, began employing powerful data analytics tools to spot suspicious transaction patterns. The rapid movement of funds between multiple jurisdictions, the use of corporate vehicles in secrecy havens, the circular flow of money. The once opaque layers began to turn translucent. The 2008 global financial crisis, ironically, was another turning point. The near collapse of the banking system led to a regulatory tsunami. Laws like the U.S. Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, forced foreign banks to disclose information about U.S. account holders, creating a domino effect of transparency that made the traditional hide-and-seek of illicit finance exponentially harder. Banks, terrified of billion-dollar fines, became de facto law enforcement agents, closing accounts and filing suspicious activity reports on a scale never seen before. Mikhailov's financial lifeblood began to clot. The final, most personalized blow to this system came from the targeted sanction applied to him and his inner circle by the United States and the European Union. Being placed on an OFAC sanctions list is a financial death sentence in the modern world. It doesn't just freeze existing assets. It triggers a global corporate quarantine. Any bank that touches his money risks losing its corresponding banking relationships with the U.S. dollar system, a fate worse than any fine. This rendered his intricate web of accounts functionally useless for international business. He was forced into cruder, riskier methods, bulk cash smuggling over or under-invoicing of real goods, and a heavy reliance on cryptocurrencies, which themselves have become increasingly monitored. Thus, the downfall of Sergei Mikhailov, in a very tangible sense, was a financial siege. The state might not have been able to jail him in Russia, and Western nations might not have been able to extradite him, but they could, and did, starve his empire of its oxygen, the free flow of capital across borders. They systematically dismantled the brilliant machine he had built, not with police raids alone, but with regulatory weaponry and financial forensics. His story, therefore, stands as a landmark case in the new era of economic warfare against crime. It proved that the most powerful criminal is ultimately vulnerable at the point of his greatest strength. his wallet. The Godfather could be shielded from bullets by walls of loyalists and from judges by layers of corruption, but he could not be shielded from the inexorable, silent pressure of a global financial system that decided, collectively, to freeze him out. His operational demise was not heralded by a gangland shootout, but by the quiet clicking shut of bank vaults and the freezing of wire transfer. A silent, digital coup de grace executed by men in suits analyzing spreadsheets thousands of miles away from the streets of Solntsevskaya, while the financial siege crippled the empire's global reach. Transformation of Russia itself, under Vladimir Putin, reshaped the very ground upon which Mikhailov stood, redefining the rules of power in a way that rendered his original business model obsolete. To understand his downfall within his homeland, one must move beyond the narrative of a simple state crackdown and examine the more profound phenomenon of state co-option and re-centralization. The 1990s, Mikhailov's heyday, were a period of what academics term state capture, where private actors, oligarchs, and crime lords so dominated the weak, fledgling state that they effectively dictated its policies and plundered its resources. Mikhailov was a master of this environment, his corporation a shadow state. The arrival of Putin marked a decisive reversal, the recapture of the state by a central authority determined to subjugate all rival power centers, be they political, economic, or criminal. This was not merely a law and order campaign. It was the re-establishment of a monopoly on violence, tribute, and legitimacy. For Mikhailov, this presented an existential paradox. His wealth and influence were vast, but they were now liabilities if exercised independently. The new Kremlin doctrine held that there could be no sovereign power outside its walls. Criminal syndicates were given a stark choice: be annihilated or be assimilated. Many of his former competitors who chose to resist, like the volatile and rebellious crew of the Chechen mobster Kaj Ahmed Nukayev, were systematically and brutally destroyed, often by state security forces acting with overwhelming force. Mikhailov, the supreme pragmatist, understood the new calculus. His downfall, therefore, was in large part a strategic capitulation to a superior force, a merger of his residual assets into the state conglomerate. His networks, particularly those in intelligence gathering, international logistics, and clandestine finance, were of immense value to a resurgent Russia seeking to project power and circumvent Western sanction. It is widely believed by analysts that elements of his old organization were effectively nationalized, their skills repurposed for state objectives. Former Solntsevskaya enforcers and fixers found new employment in state-aligned private military companies like the Wagner Group, applying their brutal tradecraft in Ukraine, Syria, and Africa. His financial experts may have been consulted in crafting schemes to evade international sanctions on Russian oligarchs and state companies. In this light, Mikhailov's peaceful, wealthy retirement in Moscow is not a sign of his enduring untouchability, but the payoff in a negotiated settlement. He traded his operational autonomy for his life and liberty, becoming a living, breathing symbol of the state's ultimate victory. He is a constant reminder to all would-be criminal sovereigns: this is as good as it gets, and it is a gift from the Kremlin that can be revoked at any time. His existence in this gilded cage also serves a practical purpose for the state. He is a node, reference point in the vast, informal network of Siloviki, powermen, and businessmen. He can facilitate introductions, vouch for loyalties, and provide historical context that exists in no written file. In a system built on personal relationships and shadowy understandings, such a living archive has value. Yet, this role comes with immense vulnerability. His safety is entirely conditional on his continued usefulness and, more importantly, his perceived loyalty. Any suspicion that he is operating off the books, rebuilding an independent network, or sharing his immense knowledge with foreign entities would likely result in a swift and terminal conclusion. The man who once commanded global syndicates now lives by the whims of a state that viewed him as a retired asset, to to be protected or discarded based on cold political utility. This final stage of his life, therefore, represents the most complete form of downfall for a man whose identity was built on control. He has traded the exhilaration of command for the quiet anxiety of dependence. The king of the shadow economy has been pensioned off, his crown replaced by a discreet, secure detail that protects him as much as it monitors him. His story culminates not with a bang, but with a barely audible sigh of submission, a masterclass in how absolute power, once decentralized, can be relentlessly re-centralized, absorbing even the most formidable of its former competitors into its cold, impersonal embrace. Beyond the geopolitical shifts and financial sieges lies the human dimension of Mikhailov's story, the personal cost of a life lived in the absolute extremes of power and peril. To view him solely as a criminal CEO is to miss the profound isolation and existential burden that became the true markers of his later years. The young waiter who dreamed of controlling flows of capital eventually found himself the most controlled individual of all, trapped in a prison of his own making, whose walls were made of paranoia, betrayal, and the ghosts of his past actions. Consider the psychological landscape he inhabited after the Thai arrest and the effective house arrest in Russia. Trust, the foundational currency of any human relationship, was for him a toxic asset. Every associate, no matter how long-standing, was a potential informant for the FSB, the FBI, or rival faction. Every friend could be an enemy wearing a mask of loyalty. Every luxury, the imported delicacy, the new staff member, the gift from a business partner carried the potential of poison, literal or metaphorical. This constant state of hypervigilance is a form of relentless psychological torture, eroding the soul even as the body lives in opulence. The man who commanded thousands likely could not share an unguarded thought with another human being. His family life, shrouded in secrecy, would have been conducted behind layers of security, turning normal familial bonds into managed high-risk operations. The weight of his actions must also have been a solitary burden. While he may have rationalized his empire as a business, its operations were funded on rivers of human suffering. The addicts destroyed by his drugs, the lives shattered by his trafficked weapons in conflict zones, the women and men whose freedom was stolen in his human trafficking schemes. These were not abstract line items on a balance sheet, they were cumulative consequences that, by any measure of human conscience, would weigh heavily. Whether Mikhailov possessed a conventional conscience is unknown, but the very measures he took to insulate himself, the remoteness, the delegation of violence, the philanthropic veneer, suggest a need to distance his self-image from the brutal reality of his wealth's origins. This cognitive dissonance itself is a corrosive force. Furthermore, his downfall into irrelevance, negotiated though it was, would have been a profound assault on the identity of a man whose entire sense of self was built upon efficacy and control. To be rendered a museum piece, a consultant to be occasionally tapped for historical insight, is a devastating fate for a visionary. He had to witness his life's work, the corporate model he invented, be copied, adapted, and surpassed by others, often with state backing he could never have accessed in his independent prime. The new generation of Siloviki oligarchs and state-sanctioned enforcers now wielded the kind of impunity he had once carved out for himself, but they did so without the entrepreneurial genius. Operating instead as blunt instruments of a centralized will, he became a relic, a living anachronism in the very system he helped shape. There is also the ever-present shadow of mortality, not from law enforcement, but from the unpredictable violence of the world he created. The assassination of his old associate, the mobster turned whistleblower, Alexander Litvinenko, with radioactive polonium-210 in London in 2006, was a stark demonstration of the reach and ruthlessness of the new state-aligned powers. It showed that death could come in unimaginable, grotesque forms, anywhere in the world. For Mikhailov, such events were not just news stories, they were a reminder of the grisly potential that lay at the end of any misstep. His survival, therefore, was not a relaxed retirement, but a continuous, silent negotiation with a fate that had claimed so many of his peers. The gilded estate outside Moscow was not a sanctuary, but the most comfortable cell in a panopticon, where the warden's identity was fluid, and the rules could change without notice. In this light, the downfall of Sergei Mikhailov is perhaps most complete, not in the boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the quiet of his own mind. He achieved a survival that eluded so many, but at the cost of everything that makes a human life free: trust, peace, authenticity, and the unburdened enjoyment of one's achievements. He won the game of survival by fundamentally altering the rules, only to find the prize was a beautifully appointed emptiness. His story thus transcends crime and becomes a classical tragedy in a modern key, the tale of a man who gained the whole world, but in the process lost any semblance of a soul, ending his days as the most well-guarded ghost in Russia, a specter haunted by the very empire he conjured into being. The reverberation of Mikhailov's empire and his personal saga extended far beyond the man himself, fundamentally altering the ecology of global crime and the strategy employed to combat it, leaving a legacy that is studied in intelligence academies and business schools alike, albeit for starkly different reasons. His most profound impact was the paradigm shift he engineered. He demonstrated that organized crime could, and indeed must, operate with the strategic foresight and operational discipline of a multinational corporation to achieve lasting power and profitability. This shifted the competitive landscape entirely. The brawling territorial street gangs of the 20th century began to look like amateur operations next to the sleek, financialized model he championed. This forced a Darwinian evolution in criminal enterprises worldwide, groups that failed to adopt similar structures, rigorous financial controls, separation between leadership and operation, investment in cyber capabilities, and legal camouflage were either absorbed, destroyed, or relegated to the minor leagues. He effectively professionalized the upper echelons of the global underworld, creating a new benchmark for success that was measured in market share, asset diversification, and political insulation rather than mere body counts or street corner dominance. Consequently, his influence is seen in the operational blueprints of group as disparate as the Sinaloa cartel's financial networks, the diversification of Italian mafia clans into public sector corruption and green energy fraud, and the franchise-like spread of Nigerian cybercrime syndicates. He didn't necessarily inspire them directly, but he proved the model worked on a colossal scale, providing a case study in ambitious criminal scalability. On the flip side, his career served as the ultimate training simulator for international law enforcement. The frustration and partial successes in tracking him catalyzed a revolution in policing tactics. The old kingpin strategy of decapitation, arresting the top boss, was proven insufficient against a corporatized structure where leadership was dispersed and operations could continue autonomously. This led to the development of the network strategy, targeting the essential connector and facilitators, the accountants, the lawyers, the bankers, and the cyber specialists. The painstaking multi-year investigations that finally chipped away at his financial infrastructure, like the Spanish Operation Troika, became the new template for combating transnational crime. These investigations required unprecedented levels of international data sharing, the development of complex financial forensic tools and legal frameworks for asset recovery and confiscation that crossed borders. In many ways, agencies like the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, with its powerful sanctioning abilities, found one of their most significant early tests in attempting to strangle entities like the Solntsevskaya Brotherhood. The legal and operational playbook used today to target jihadist financiers, Latin American cartel leaders, and ransomware groups was partly written in the long shadow war against Mikhailov's empire. His life also provided a grim object lesson in the vulnerabilities of emerging democracies and transitional economies. The looting of Russia in the 1990s, in which he played a starring role, stands as a cautionary tale for nations undergoing rapid privatization and economic liberalization without robust legal institutions and anti-corruption frameworks. It illustrated how criminal capital, unleashed during a moment of state weakness, can become so deeply entrenched in the economic and political fabric that it becomes nearly impossible to root out, instead morphing into a permanent, corrosive feature of the system. Furthermore, his eventual fate underscored a harsh geopolitical reality. For a transnational criminal of his stature, there is no final escape. The world, for him, bifurcated into two equally untenable options. Outside Russia, he was a hunted fugitive, subject to arrest and extradition in an increasingly interconnected judicial world. Inside Russia, he was a subdued asset of a state that tolerated him only under strict conditions of obedience. This left him with no true sovereign territory, no nation where he could be both free and secure, a stark lesson for any criminal aspiring to global reach. Ultimately, Mikhailov's story is a foundational myth for the modern age of globalization, a dark twin to the tales of Silicon Valley disruptors and Wall Street titans. He was a disruptor of the illicit markets, an innovator in criminal logistics, and a pioneer in the merger of violence and venture capital. His rise mirrored the explosive growth of global connectedness in the 1990s, and his containment mirrored the subsequent tightening of global financial and security networks in the 21st century. He exists now as a complex symbol of ruthless ambition achieved, of the limits of criminal power against resurgent state and international cooperation, and of the profound personal void that lies at the center of a life built on predation. His biography is not just the story of a gangster. It is a diagnostic chart of the world's vulnerabilities at a specific, chaotic historical juncture, and a record of how the world slowly, imperfectly, began to develop antibodies to comprehend the sheer scale of the Solntsevskaya Brotherhood's operations at its zenith is to attempt to map a shadow continent, a landmass of illicit activity whose coastlines touched every continent and whose inland territory comprised entire sectors of the legitimate global economy. It was an entity of such staggering breadth that its annual revenue was estimated by intelligence agencies to be in the multiple billion of dollars, a figure that would place it comfortably within the Fortune 500 list of the world's largest corporation. This revenue stream was not monolithic, but a vast, delta-like network of tributaries, each fed by a different form of human vice or systemic weakness. The narcotics division alone operated as a fully integrated supply chain, from negotiating production agreements with Afghan opium lords and Colombian cartel bosses to managing refining labs hidden in the forests of Belarus and Ukraine, to controlling distribution networks across every major European city through a mix of franchise street gangs and corrupt transport unions. The Brotherhood exhibited a logistical prowess that rivaled Amazon. A single, successful heroin shipment from Central Asia to the streets of Berlin could involve dozens of compartmentalized actors, corrupt customs officials at multiple borders, pilot of aging cargo planes with falsified manifests, warehouse managers in Riga or Warsaw, and a hierarchy of wholesalers and retailers who never knew the name of their ultimate supplier. This was not mere smuggling. It was precision logistics applied to misery. The arms trafficking operation was similarly vast, capitalizing on the apocalyptic fire sale of the Soviet military-industrial complex. They didn't just sell crates of Kalashnikovs. They brokered the transfer of entire anti-aircraft systems, tanks, and heavy artillery to conflict zones in Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East, often acting as the crucial middleman between desperate buyers and corrupt post-Soviet generals. The financial returns were astronomical. but so was the geopolitical destabilization they fueled, making them unseen architects of foreign conflicts. Parallel to this ran the human trafficking pipeline, a coldly efficient people-moving operation that treated human beings as high-value, perishable cargo. They exploited the desperation of post-Soviet economic collapse, luring victims with promises of jobs as waitresses, models, or construction workers in the West, only to confiscate their documents and sell them into sexual slavery or forced labor. This operation required its own specialized infrastructure, corrupt officials to provide passports, trucking companies with hidden compartments, safe houses across Eastern Europe, and brothel owners from Tel Aviv to Milan who were permanent clients beyond these core product lines. The Brotherhood's tentacles extended into virtually every profitable niche. They ran massive fuel smuggling scams, stealing state-subsidized Russian oil and gas, and selling it at market price abroad. They orchestrated complex tax frauds and embezzlement schemes against the Russian government itself. They engaged in large-scale copyright piracy, controlling the distribution of counterfeit everything from software and DVDs to luxury handbags and pharmaceuticals. They muscled into the waste disposal and construction industries in Moscow, using their enforcement wing to win lucrative state contracts. They even had a significant stake in the global trade of conflict diamonds and other precious resources, providing the muscle and smuggling routes for warlords in Africa. This diversification was a deliberate corporate strategy to mitigate risk and ensure cash flow. If one sector came under pressure, say, a heroin route was compromised revenue from fuel smuggling, prostitution rings, or financial fraud would keep the empire solvent. Managing this behemoth required a headquarters-like structure. At its core was the Leadership Council, with Mikhailov as chairman, setting strategic direction. Below them were sector directors, each a specialist in their field, a director of narcotics, a director of financial operations, a director of enforcement. These directors managed regional managers who oversaw operations in specific countries or territories. The infamous sportsmen, the enforcers, were not a mindless mob but a stratified internal security force, with some units specializing in protection, others in debt collection, and an elite tier reserved for acts of assassination and intergang warfare. This entire apparatus was lubricated by a pervasive system of corruption that reached into the highest level of the Russian government, the police, the judiciary, and the nascent financial regulatory bodies. This was not the empire of a gangster. It was the dark counterpart to a nation-state's economy, a fully realized criminal parallel society with its own export-import balance, its own employment scheme, and its own shadow foreign policy. Understanding this scale is crucial to grasping the magnitude of the challenge faced by law enforcement, and the reason why Mikhailov's eventual containment, even without a life sentence in a Western prison, represents one of the most significant counter-organized crime operations of the modern era. They didn't just arrest a man, they slowly, piece by piece, disabled a machine that had woven itself into the circulatory system of the world. The international pursuit of Mikhailov and the dismantling of his network forged a new era of collaboration that permanently altered the landscape of global law enforcement, proving that only a network could effectively combat a network. This was not a seamless or naturally harmonious process. It was born of necessity, fraught with mistrust, bureaucratic rivalry, and legal incompatibilities. Yet it yielded a framework that stands today as the primary defense against transnational crime. The initial investigations in the early 1990s were stymied by these very divisions. The FBI viewed the Solntsevskaya Brotherhood as a foreign problem. European agencies were focused on their own domestic gangs. Russian authorities, in the chaotic post-Soviet period, were often part of the problem, with corrupt elements actively shielding the organization. The breakthrough came when analysts in various agencies began to connect local crimes to a global pattern. A money laundering case in New York revealed ties to a bank in Cyprus that was also implicated in a Spanish drug investigation. A murder in Frankfurt was linked to a dispute over a prostitution ring that was funded by a Russian front company in Latvia. Slowly, a mosaic emerged, and its scale demanded a unified response. This led to the creation of ad hoc joint task forces, unprecedented in their composition. FBI agents sat alongside officers from Spain's Guardia Civil, German BKA investigators, and analysts from Interpol and Europol. They established secure communication channels and began the painstaking work of mapping the organization structure using methods borrowed from intelligence agencies tracking terrorist cells. They employed link analysis software to visualize relationships between suspects, financial forensic experts to follow the money across dozens of jurisdictions, and multilingual teams to translate intercepted communications from Russian slang into actionable intelligence. The legal hurdles were immense. Evidence gathered in one country often could not be used in another due to differing standards of judicial procedure. A wiretap authorized in Italy was worthless in a Swiss court. This forced nations to negotiate mutual legal assistance treaties, MLATs, and streamline extradition processes specifically to target groups like the Brotherhood. The pressure applied by the United States was particularly instrumental, using its economic might as leverage. The U.S. Treasury's threat of sanctioning entire foreign banks that facilitated Solntsevskaya money laundering forced financial institutions worldwide to tighten their compliance and cooperate with investigations they would have previously ignored. This collective effort created a form of global pressure that no single nation could apply. While Russia remained a reluctant and often hostile partner, the flow of intelligence from other countries eventually created an undeniable body of evidence that even compromised officials within Russia could not entirely dismiss, contributing to the domestic political pressure that led to Mikhailov's 1996 trial. The operational successes were gradual but cumulative. The arrest of key financial facilitators in Spain and Switzerland disrupted cash flows. The seizure of drug shipments in Belgium and the Netherlands hurt revenues. The freezing of assets in the UK and France diminished their investment capital. Each action was a cut, none fatal on its own, but together they bled the beast. This collaborative model, pioneered in the fight against Mikhailov's empire, became the blueprint for subsequent efforts against global threats. The methodologies developed the fusion of financial intelligence with criminal investigation, the use of multi-jurisdictional task forces, the strategic application of targeted sanctions were directly applied to the post-9/11 fight against terrorist financing, the crackdown on Latin American cartels, and the current battle against ransomware gangs and cybercrime syndicates. In a very real sense, the war against the Solntsevskaya Brotherhood was the proving ground for modern international police cooperation. It taught the world that in an age of globalization, crime knows no borders, and therefore, policing cannot afford to. The walls of jurisdictional sovereignty had to be made porous for justice to flow. The lasting institutional legacy is seen in entities like Europol's European Cybercrime Center, the FBI's dedicated Eurasian Organized Crime Task Forces, and the dense web of information-sharing agreements that connect financial intelligence units from Washington to Wellington. Mikhailov, in his relentless global expansion, inadvertently became the catalyst for the creation of a more unified, albeit still imperfect, global police force. His downfall, therefore, is not just the story of a man being caught, but of a system being built, a system designed to ensure that no single criminal, no matter how brilliant or well-funded, could ever again build such an unchecked, global parallel empire with the same impunity. The world closed the barn door after the horse had bolted, but in doing so it built a stronger door and a better alarm system for every stable thereafter. The final, lingering question that surrounds the figure of Sergei Mikhailov is not one of fact, but of legacy and moral accounting. What does his life, this intricate tapestry woven with threads of ambition, innovation, brutality, and survival, ultimately signify in the broader narrative of our time? He eluded the classic cinematic demise. No dramatic shootout, no life sentence in a supermax prison, no inglorious death in a ditch. Instead, he achieved a paradoxical kind of victory by surrendering on all fronts except the most basic one, continued existence. This outcome forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and the nature of evil in a complex, interconnected world. His story is a stark rebuttal to simplistic moral fables. It demonstrates that in the real world, particularly in the chaotic interstices between collapsing and rising empire, the most successful evil is not the mustache-twirling villain, but the cold, systematic administrator. Mikhailov was not a psychopath reveling in violence. He was a capitalist who found the ultimate deregulated market in human suffering. His genius was recognizing that the structures of late 20th century globalization, ease of travel, digital finance, free trade zones, and weak states could be weaponized for illicit profit on an industrial scale. In this, he was a dark pioneer, a perverse innovator whose disruptions caused immeasurable human harm. His legacy, therefore, is etched not in stone monuments, but in the corrupted systems and normalized criminal methodologies that persist. He proved that immense wealth could armor a man against conventional justice, but also that such wealth inevitably attracts the attention of a greater Leviathan, the state, which will eventually demand its tribute of obedience. His life is a case study in the limits of criminal sovereignty. He reached the zenith of what any individual operating outside the law can achieve, and that zenith was ultimately a dead end, boxed in by international finance and domestic political recentralization. For the citizens of Russia and the world, his saga serves as a grim lesson in institutional vulnerability. His rise was a direct symptom of the Soviet Union's pathological collapse, where the evaporation of one form of authority created a vacuum filled by the most ruthless and cunning. It highlights how crucial robust, transparent institutions are in preventing the criminal capture of a state during periods of transition. For the countless victims of his empire, the addicts, a traffic, the families destroyed by his weapons, his comfortable retirement in Moscow is a grotesque insult, a living testament to the imperfect, often infuriating machinery of global justice. It underscores a painful reality. While low-level criminals pay with their freedom, the architects of vast criminal enterprise often pay only with their peace of mind, trading a prison of bricks for a prison of paranoia and compromise. Yet, to view him solely as a monster is to miss the terrifying banality of his operation. He was, in his own mind, a businessman, a problem solver, a builder of efficient systems. This cognitive disconnect is perhaps his most disturbing facet. It shows how evil can be operationalized, broken down into quarterly profits and logistical challenges, stripped of its visceral horror by layers of management and abstraction. In the end, Sergei Mikhailov stands as a singular, contradictory symbol of his era. He's a symbol of the anarchic potential unleashed by the end of the Cold War, a reminder of the dark underbelly of globalization. He is a symbol of the terrifying efficacy of applying corporate logic to sin. And he is a symbol of the eventual, if incomplete, reassertion of order, whether through the slow grind of international law or the iron fist of the resurgent state. His story does not have a moral in the traditional sense. It does not promise that crime doesn't pay. It paid him handsomely. It does not promise that justice always prevails. He walks free. What it offers instead is a sobering, panoramic view of the dynamic of power in the modern world, how it is built, how it is challenged, and how it is ultimately contained, not by heroes but by systems, patience, and the inexorable shift of political tides. He is less a man now and more a historical force, a human embodiment of a specific, turbulent period where the rules were being rewritten, and he for a time wrote some of the most devastating ones. His quiet life today is the afterlife of a storm, the calm that followed, the tempest he helped unleash, a reminder that even the most violent forces are eventually absorbed, dissipated, or driven underground by the greater pressures of a world moving, however fitful, toward a fragile order. To chart the aftermath and the enduring echo of the Solntsevskaya Empire is to observe a phenomenon akin to ecological succession, where a dominant species recedes, leaving a transformed landscape that new organisms colonize and adapt to. Mikhailov's forced retirement and the state's co-option of his networks did not create a vacuum, it created a market opportunity and a new set of rules for the next generation of illicit entrepreneurs. The criminal ecosystem of Russia and its diaspora evolved, internalizing the lessons of his rise and his containment. The most significant change was the total disappearance of the independent challenger criminal corporation on the Solntsevskaya model. The message from the Kremlin was unequivocal. Private armies and competing centers of power would not be tolerated. As a result, the most ambitious and capable criminal operators now seek not to build independent empires, but to embed themselves within the state-sanctioned power structures. They become enablers rather than bosses. This has given rise to a new archetype, the Silovic businessman, often with roots in the security services, who uses his official or quasi-official position to control lucrative sectors like customs, construction, or resource extraction while employing former criminal specialists for enforcement and off-the-books operation. These figures are far more dangerous than the classic mobster because they operate under a cloak of legitimacy and patriotism. Their illicit activities often intertwined with state policy, such as evading Western sanctions or projecting power abroad through mercenary groups. The old Solntsevskaya's international drug and arms trafficking routes did not vanish. They were nationalized in spirit. Control over the corridors is now often contested or managed by state intelligence agencies and their affiliated private military companies, who use them for revenue generation and geopolitical leverage. The financial expertise honed by Mikhailov's money launderers is now employed in far more sophisticated schemes to bypass international financial sanctions, using cryptocurrency mixers, complex gold and diamond trades, and networks of friendly jurisdictions. In this new environment, a figure like Mikhailov is an anachronism. His legacy lives on in the methods, not the structure. Cybercrime, which he helped pioneer as a strategic pivot, has become the dominant growth sector for Russian-speaking organized crime, operate in a decentralized entrepreneurial swarm that is harder for any state to fully control even as it tolerates or exploits it. Groups like Evil Corp, or the ransomware collective operating from Russia and its neighbors, are the spiritual successors to Mikhailov's corporate ethos. They are tech startups with a violent edge, focused on high margins, low physical risk, and global scalability. They lack his grand, unifying corporate vision, but they excel in agile, parasitic adaptation. Furthermore, the diaspora of former Solntsevskaya operatives has spread its influence globally. In Spain, the UAE, and Thailand, individuals linked to the old Brotherhood now operate as semi-legitimate businessmen, investing launder capital into real estate and hospitality, acting as fixers and intermediaries between the Russian elite and the local underworld. They are the keepers of the old networks, the connectors who can make things happen across borders, but they no longer answer to a single king in Moscow. The Brotherhood persists as a brand, a reputation, and a loose network of mutual interest, but not as a commanded hierarchy. For law enforcement, the challenge has metastasized. The target is no longer a single corporation with a known board of directors, but a fluid symbiosis between state power and criminal enterprise, where criminal acts can be disguised as statecraft and state interests are advanced through criminal means. This makes traditional investigation nearly impossible, as agencies run into walls of state secrecy and diplomatic immunity. The international collaboration that hurt Mikhailov is less effective against this new model, as it relies on a degree of state cooperation that is absent when the state itself is a participant. Thus, the downfall of Sergei Mikhailov marked the end of an era and the beginning of a more complex, more insidious one. He represented the peak of private criminal power. His successors operate in the twilight zone between public and private, where crime is not an alternative to the state, but a tool of it. His story, therefore, is the closing chapter of one book and the ominous prologue of another. He was the last of the great independent criminal industrialists the world he left behind is one where the lines are so blurred that the very concept of organized crime must be redefined to account for its deep, systemic entanglement with political power. The king is gone, but the kingdom has been absorbed into a larger, more powerful, and infinitely more ambiguous empire. As we draw this exhaustive chronicle toward its close, it is essential to step back from the granular details of deals, arrests, and structural shifts to consider the overarching narrative arc of Sergei Mikhailov's life arc that traces the metamorphosis of a man into a myth and a criminal enterprise into a historical force. His journey from the drab corridors of a Soviet restaurant to the pinnacle of a global shadow empire, and then into a gilded obscurity, mirrors the turbulent trajectory of Russia itself over the last half-century. He was a product of the Soviet stagnation, a creature of its chaotic collapse, a king of the anarchic interregnum, and finally, a pensioner of the new authoritarian order that rose from the ashes. His biography is, in a sense, a secret history of modern Russia told not through political speeches or economic indices, but through the accumulation of capital in the shadows and the violent negotiation of power where the state had retreated. Each phase of his life illuminates a facet of that era, the entrepreneurial hustle required to survive in late socialism, the ruthless opportunism of the privatization, loans for shares era, the brazen globalization of the 1990s, and the stark, unforgiving recentralization of the 2000s. He was not just living through history, he was actively, aggressively shaping one of its darkest tributaries, the myth of Mikhas that persists today in whispered rumors, in true crime documentary, in the wary respect of old underworld figures, is larger than the man. It has become a symbol of a specific kind of power, intelligent, adaptable, and utterly without scruple, yet bound by the ultimate limitation of operating outside the sanctity of the state. He is a folk anti-hero for some, a cautionary tale for others, and for most, a remote, almost fictional character from a time when Russia seemed to be tearing itself apart and rebuilding itself according to the law of the jungle. This mythologization is the final stage of his downfall, for it removes him from the realm of the actionable present and places him safely in the past, a monster who has been tamed, a legend whose story has been told. For the Russian state, this is the ideal outcome. A once defiant rival now exists as a control narrative, a piece of managed history that reinforces the state's ultimate authority. They allow the myth to persist because it serves them. It reminds everyone of what happens to those who become too powerful without the Kremlin's blessing. In the wider world, his story endures as a masterclass in the anatomy of a criminal corporation. It is studied by intelligence analysts, criminologists, and even business strategists interested in network resilience and supply chain management under extreme duress. The very fact that his case is dissected in academic papers and professional training seminars is a testament to its complexity and significance. He created a template that was both brilliantly effective and fatally flawed, a blueprint that showed the potential and the peril of building a sovereign criminal enterprise in a world of nation-states. The flaw, of course, was that his sovereignty was always contingent, always borrowed from the weakness of others, and when the others, be it the Russian state or the international financial system, regained their strength, his borrowed power was recalled. As he lives out his remaining years in the quiet of his fortress estate, the world he helped shape continues to spin, transformed by his passage. The global anti-money laundering regime is stricter because of him. International police cooperation is deeper because of the effort to catch him. The understanding of how crime can infiltrate the highest levels of finance and government is more acute because of his example. In a perverse way, he made the world slightly more vigilant, slightly more connected in its defense, though at a horrific cost. His downfall, therefore, is not a single event but a process of containment, of adaptation, and of historical absorption. He was not defeated in a hail of bullets, outmaneuvered in a long game of geopolitical chess and financial strangulation. The final image is not of a broken man in chains, but of a wealthy, elderly figure looking out over a secure perimeter, prisoner of his own success, his empire dismantled, his methods adopted by others, his name etched forever in the annals of infamy. He achieved immortality of a sort, but it is the immortality of a warning, a permanent exhibit in the museum of human ambition gone rogue. The story of Sergei Mikhailov, the Solntsevskaya boss, concludes not with a period, but with an ellipsis, a trailing off into the silent, watchful, and heavily guarded present, where the past is a country he can never leave, and his legacy is a ghost that haunts the systems he once mastered and that finally mastered him. We have journeyed together through the shadowed corridors of one of history's most formidable criminal empires, from its roots in Soviet scarcity to its global dominance and its eventual complex containment. The story of Sergei Mikhailov is a stark tapestry woven with threads of ruthless ambition, chilling innovation, and the inexorable gravity of state power. We witnessed the birth of a corporate philosophy applied to crime, the audacious capture of a nation's wealth during its moment of weakness, and the creation of a transnational machine that dealt in drugs, weapons, and human souls with cold, logistical precision. We followed the long international pursuit that slowly tightened the noose, not through dramatic confrontations, but through financial forensics and multi-jurisdictional persistence. We saw the final act not in a prison cell, but in a negotiated surrender to a resurgent Russian state, transforming the kingpin into a retired asset, his empire dismantled or absorbed. His world shrunk to the dimensions of a gilded cage. His legacy is a double-edged sword, a blueprint for criminal efficiency that forever changed the underworld, and a cautionary tale that spurred the evolution of global law enforcement. He stands as a permanent monument to a specific, chaotic historical moment, a human embodiment of the law of the jungle that briefly ruled in the absence of the state. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the vulnerability of our economic and political systems, the terrifying potential of a moral genius, and the ultimate, non-negotiable supremacy of the sovereign state in the modern world. This narrative, pieced together from countless sources across the globe, was presented with a single purpose: to bring you the unvarnished, complex reality behind the legend, to inform and to illustrate the hidden architectures of power that shape our world. If this deep dive into the real underworld has captivated you, if you appreciate these meticulously researched explorations of history's most enigmatic and powerful figures, then your journey does not have to end here. The world is filled with untold stories of shadow empires, clandestine operations, and the secret histories that simmer beneath the surface of official accounts. We are committed to unearthing these narratives and presenting them to you with the same depth and clarity. By subscribing to this channel and ringing the notification bell, You ensure you do not miss our next investigation. We delve where others skim. We connect the dots that others ignore, and we bring you the facts, however shocking, to empower you with knowledge. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other hidden figures or clandestine operations would you like us to explore? Your curiosity guides our mission. This is not just history. It is an understanding of the forces that have shaped and continue to shape our present. Knowledge is your power. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and join us as we continue to pull back the curtain. Subscribe now.